All right, we're back. I decided to cut off that last recording kind of in the middle, so that way this was more of a manageable series of lectures to get through. I personally tend to like the longer lectures that are like a full class, so you sit down and watch it all in one sitting. But then if you don't want to, you can always pause wherever you want. But I know a lot of other people prefer them to be much shorter and to focus on one specific topic within there. So trying to reach a happy medium. I said, oh, okay, we're at like over 20 minutes. Time to stop here. So I'll pick up where we left off. So we're going to walk through an example of wages and employment in the Alaska labor market. I believe. There we go. Yes, I was on the wrong slide. Here. So this is our model of supply and demand. If you look at S0, the supply curve that goes up, and D0, the demand curve that goes down, that's basically what we were dealing with last time. But this is showing a shift in the demand curve. So moving from D0 to D1. Now, I'll walk through very briefly the example, relying on some of the work from the textbook to explain what's happening. Again, this isn't something that you need to deep dive into, understand everything completely right now, but it's showing how we can use some of the analysis, giving you a preview of what hopefully you'll be able to do within a couple weeks. So back in 1968, oil was discovered in remote northern Alaska. The oil reserves were estimated to be greater than 10 billion barrels. That's right. So this is the largest discovery in North America at the time. The only issue is that this is in a remote area of Alaska, which is, I don't know if you guys know this, really, really cold. Very few people live there. So they had serious trouble of trying to figure out how to transport oil to the consumers that wanted to buy it, who lived in much, much more reasonable places. So oil companies proposed building a pipeline this stretch all the way across northern Alaska down to a port where they could easily transport it to where consumers lived. Now, a bunch of oil companies joined forces to form a pipeline project in Alaska. Construction began in the 70s and was completed by 1977. So, of course, as we all know, the year Star Wars came. During this time, about the 3-4 years it took them to build the pipeline, around 25,000 workers were employed in building it. And then subcontractors brought an additional 25,000 workers. Once the pipeline was completed, they didn't need all the workers actually building it. So they reduced their employment down to a small maintenance crew instead of what it takes to build a pipeline. Very few of those engineers were from Alaska. They built pipelines around the world because they're specialists in building pipelines. I couldn't just step in and build a pipeline. You need someone who's skilled and understands that. But there were a lot of workforce that were more relatively lower skilled labor. So you need truck drivers, excavators, something that still takes some skill and training, but isn't something that's as laser focused as someone who's like an architect trying to build a pipeline. So the theoretical framework of supply and demand, this simple model that we have, can help us understand the shifts that should have occurred in the Alaskan labor market as a result of this. So what we would expect to happen is basically what we see here in the supply and demand curve. Initially, we're at D0. That this is how many workers the firms are willing to hire in Alaska. And the equilibrium here at wage 0 and employment level 0. Then there's this new project that's being started. Suddenly, firms need a lot more workers to be working in the area to build that pipeline. So it shifts the demand curve out from D0 to D1. They're going to be willing to pay higher wages, and it's also going to see an increase in the number of workers that are employed. So this is a sizable increase in the demand for labor. So what we would say is that this shift in the demand curve moved the Alaskan labor market to a new equilibrium. So where it used to be down here at E0 and W0, now up here at W1 and E1. So we now have a higher wage being paid for these workers and a lot more workers working. You're going to have to offer something to entice workers to move up to this remote region in Alaska, to give up, seeing their family, seeing their friends, living in their home and having to go somewhere temporarily. So to do that, you pay higher wages and you can draw in more workers that way. So it's a very simple analysis. So now what actually happened? So this figure shows employment and wages over time in Alaska. So the population in the state was growing steadily for decades, and total employment was rising even before the oil discovery up there. So this is what we see here with employment in the black line slowly rising over time. So employment spiked, we see up here 74, 75, 76, 77, when they were building the pipelines. We have this notable increase in employment in the state at the time. But then it drops back down afterwards and returns more to the previous trend. Now you don't have these, all the construction workers and all the people designing the pipeline needing to work up there. So we see as they leave to go work on other projects in other parts of the country or around the world, we see the employment start to decline and level off for a while. Now, when we look at earnings, and these earnings are adjusted for inflation, we see what we would expect. Wages also substantially increased during this time period, and then drop back down to what we would expect after that, the temporary increase in employment. So going back to the previous slide, we expected both wages to increase and employment to increase. And seeing what happened, that's exactly what happened during that time. What this slide doesn't show is what happened after the pipeline was completed, which is this demand curve returning back down towards the original demand curve at D0. And that's what happened here in the post-1978 part. So we just walked through the highlights of the theory of labor market supply and demand, and then the example of the Alaskan oil industry. So we went through only two of the main actors, the workers and the firms. We didn't look at the government in this case. Although your textbook does talk about the government a little bit, that they had to approve the project and approve the pipeline and those some of those things. So this is not an exact replica of what happened any more than a map is literally the territory that we're covering. It's a simplification so we could see that we have something to work with. And that's why models are so great. We can add as much information as we can to be accurate, but remember, it is a balancing act. If we add too much detail, it becomes impossible to work with. And at that point, a perfectly realistic model that accounts for every single variable that could possibly affect the outcome is going to be very complicated to work with. It's just mirroring the real world. So we do need to simplify in some ways, and basically so we can concern ourselves with the things that are really important. In this case, we were interested in movements in supply and demand in the labor market, so that's what we focused on. Like I said earlier, the workers care about more than just money. So that's one example of how we simplified this. We didn't really try to put a monetary value on what it was like to move to a remote region in Alaska. And this kind of stuff is important in real life. Many of the reasons that I love working for WVU have nothing to do with my salary. It's other benefits that I get for working there. In this case, we economists like to use the Latin phrase ceteris paribus, meaning all things equal. So in this example, we're holding constant how good firms are, the flexibility of their hours, commuting distance, other non-wage benefits. All these we're holding equal. We're not considering changes in them. We're just assuming that they're all the same, so we can look at the effect of changes in wages. Is this a perfect representation of the labor market? No, it's not. But it does help us understand equilibrium. Later, if we want to consider the quality of day-to-day working for the company building the pipeline up there compared to other companies or companies in other areas, we can add that to our analysis. But it wasn't necessary for the very, very simple goals we were using in this exercise in the previous slide. So it takes some time and some effort to be able to figure out what you need to include and what you don't need to include. But both your textbook and myself will try to identify these assumptions and simplifications, tell you what we're simplifying when we work with these models in practice. So you know what we're doing, and you can get an idea of what we care about as we're doing this analysis. The comedian Stephen Wright back in the 80s had a joke about having a life-size map. It's a good joke because no one would find value in having a life-size map. Also, no one would find value in a perfect model that accounts for everything because we literally would not be able to use it either. I encourage you to read the textbook as they have a great discussion of including the right number of variables in your model. Not missing something is important, but also introducing needless complexity that is just going to harm your ability to understand what you're doing is harmful. So it's really a balancing act between the two. Very briefly, I want to talk about positive versus normative economics, and then we'll basically be ending this chapter from the textbook. So our supply and demand model is an example of positive analysis. Positive analysis is called a means-ends framework. So that's what we care about is the means to reach those ends and the ends themselves. How does the means influence what results? So in positive analysis, we only care about understanding the mechanism. How do we explain what's going on? How one thing leads to another. We don't care about any sort of commentary, whether the outcome is good or bad, whether we should want it to occur or to not occur. All we care about is what is the effect of a specific change or a specific mechanism. And we can use the tools of economics to answer these questions. Now, normative analysis is different. This focuses on values. So this is whether the outcome that results is preferable to any of the alternatives. So instead of being concerned with what is, we're concerned with what should be or what ought to be. So we can't simply reach these normative conclusions through analysis. We can say that an event will result in a specific outcome using some model, but that model is not going to tell us whether the outcome is good or bad. We can use that model to estimate some costs and some benefits to shed light on what's going on, but it requires individuals to have their own opinions and to make judgment calls. So for instance, we could say that an increase in the money supply leads to inflation. This relationship results from a very simple model, MV equals PY, or the money supply times the velocity of money equals the price level times the total output. So it's a very simple model that actually does a really good job of explaining what happens in the real world. That's positive analysis. If the money supply increases, you're going to end up seeing the price level increase. But normative analysis would involve asking, okay, is this higher inflation rate good for US consumers or is it bad for US consumers? Should we want some inflation? What is the optimal rate of inflation? We can use facts and we can use theory to make our argument in this case, but we have to make an argument. It doesn't just tell us what's good or bad. So for an example, very briefly, I don't want to get too bogged down in this stuff. It's easy to go off on tangents when I'm not in a classroom and can see you guys getting bored. But in Scotland in the 1800s, some universities pay professors a fixed sum. Some universities decided to pay their professors based on the number of students attending their lectures. So they had very different incentives facing them. Now, supporters of both systems agreed that more students would take courses that professors geared towards them, with lectures on either more interesting subjects or that are done in a more engaging manner. Now, this was positive analysis. Okay, the different payment structure is going to lead to focusing on different types of lectures, maybe different subjects, definitely on different levels of engagement. But what they disagreed with on whether that was good, they disagreed on the normative analysis. So supporters of paying the professors and lecturers based on the number of students that were in their class argued that lectures would be better to be designed towards students to give them more information. They'll retain more information because it's being designed for them. Now, opponents of this type of payment argued that lectures are going to be simplified for students so that they can understand and focus on information that they were interested in, not what the students needed to know to be, good, well-rounded graduates. So this agreement on the mechanism and on the outcomes, but disagreement on what the preference is, can be called the angel-devil test. The basic idea that the devil and the angel should agree on the positive analysis, but disagree on what's preferable, with the devil wanting the evil outcome, the angel wanting the good outcome. So if we're doing good positive analysis, people should agree on what the mechanism is and what the expected result is. But they can disagree on their normative analysis, on whether that outcome is good or bad. So we'll end very briefly with the summary of what we talked about so far. So labor economics studies how labor markets work. We're concerned with three actors: workers, firms, and the government. We're primarily going to focus on workers and firms early on, very broadly talking about how the government kind of sets boundaries in the labor market. But later on, we'll talk about more specific interventions that the governments do through laws and regulations that impact the labor market and see how that changes both firm and individual workers' decision making. So now a good theory should have realistic assumptions. So we don't want to do anything too crazy. We don't want to forget about too many things going on in the world, but it has to be something that's simple enough that we can actually work with it. So we're going to start with very simple models, just looking at supply and demand, and slowly build up more complex ones over time. And if you wanted to focus on economics as a career, we would slowly get more and more complex models over a longer period of time. We can also test this with real world data. Now, we won't be doing that so much in this class. I don't think that's important for your career, but understanding these concepts, being able to work with these models should be able to help you in career and human resources. And we can use the tools of economics to answer questions using positive analysis or positive questions, what is going to happen, those types of things. We can use them to help shed light on costs and benefits so we can make normative analysis ourselves, but that is based on very much on what we believe and how we perceive the costs and benefits of an action. So that brings us to the end of the textbook. For this module, I'll also be doing the next lecture on some of the readings on Friedrich Hayek. I understand that these can be a little difficult. I think both of them, but I know at least one of them was originally written in German and translated, so it can be very difficult to read. And he's definitely talking about some economic concepts that you guys haven't had too much experience with. Nevertheless, I think it's important. I do want to take a little bit of time early on to show some of the shortcomings of models so you can understand how to use them appropriately, and so we can understand basically how markets function, how supply and demand works. And I'll go in more details about why I'm including this in that next lecture.